Welcome to Guberman Appleby Immigration Update. We thought today was a good opportunity to start our regular YouTube installments in light of the US election last night.
Indeed, a bit of a surprise probably to everyone in Canada who was possibly hoping for a different result, but I guess we should examine what we think the opportunities are for Canadian immigration and what Americans are thinking in terms of immigrating to Canada.
Right, well, I think we can both agree that historically, regardless of the outcome of an election and always leading up to an election, we get a big upswing in queries from American citizens looking to come to Canada.
Yeah, there is very much that reaction. It's historical. It's been going on for 20 years. Whenever the party opposite to what someone thinks in the United States gets into power, there's a flurry of activity, of calls, queries, concern about entering Canada to bail out of the United States. It's less than 12 hours since the election's been called. We've already had half a dozen queries from people who queried in 2016 under the same circumstances, but now are even more panicked, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's pretty interesting because even though we always do see an uptick in these types of calls, I mean, for me, in terms of the files where the people have all followed through and actually come here, brought their families, whatever, I think it's fair to say maybe in total I've had 15 as a result of people who were kind of running from an election result in the US. And then of course what I've also seen in the past few months is almost preparatory inquiries for people who want to get the ball rolling in terms of coming here. And I think one of the most common things I've seen is situations where Canadians who are now established in the US and have had children born in the US want to take advantage of the opportunity for their children to have a Canadian passport. So obviously you can't just jump straight into attaining a Canadian passport. There's preliminary steps, and it's something we help with a lot, which is applying for a proof of citizenship. So, I mean, we've had situations where people have 3 children. All 3 of those children can apply for proof of citizenship. And not only does that let them apply for a Canadian passport, but it also gives those children opportunities to access, for example, Canadian university, which is a lot less expensive than American university.
Well, it's much less expensive if you're a Canadian citizen than it is if you're a foreign student.
Correct.
And foreign student includes Americans, yes. One of the queries we've had this morning was somebody who called us in 2016 whose children are probably Canadian citizens because of the birth of their parent in Canada. They didn't action themselves in 2016. They seem to be ready to do it now. We will see a major uptake of that, which dovetails into the new law that Canada is propagating in terms of derivative citizenship from persons born in Canada or not born in Canada if they were born abroad. Those regulations haven't really come out yet, but we know that there'll probably be some sort of significant tie test, but it will expand the opportunity for Canadian citizen derivative children born abroad, particularly in the United States, but also worldwide, to come to Canada.
Of course, and I mean, what I find really interesting is when I get people calling me who are, you know, it's not for their kids, but it might be for themselves, and they're in their 60s, 70s. I've even applied for proof of citizenship for people who are in their 80s. So I think it's sort of worth noting that unlike in some other situations where you're applying through citizenship through a Canadian parent or parent of any country, but like Canada doesn't have an age cutoff. A lot of countries are like, the child, you can only do it when you're a child. This opportunity applies to people regardless of their age.
Yes, for example, the United States has that sort of double derivative situation of second generation. If you apply before you're 18, you can get citizenship through grandparents, even if the parent wasn't a citizen or didn't have enough time in the United States. That's not true in Canada. We have a much more open policy, even without the expansion of the Canadian citizenship. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the other thing worth noting that's sort of related to this is because obviously if a Canadian has a child that was born in the United States, and there are a lot of them, there's over 800,000 Canadians who are living in the United States. So that's like a lot of people.
You counted them?
No, I looked it up on the internet.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, that also gives an opportunity to the spouses of those Canadian citizens. So that's a really nice, clean, straightforward way to get to Canada. Obviously, it takes a little bit of time, but I mean, that applies to, opposite sex spouses, same sex spouses. It applies to common law partners. So that's like a huge opportunity for people who are potentially looking to come to Canada, certainly at any time, but if people are freaking out now, that's certainly a good tool.
Well, I think the number one freak out call I received this morning was from my Canadian citizen daughter who lives in the United States and has an American citizen husband. Her children, of course, my grandchildren are, of course, both Canadian and US. She's contemplating that, so I think we'll see a great deal of that, and it's an opportunity. The interesting question is, who and why are people going to be wanting to come to Canada post the election, or at all? I mean, we're a very different country than the United States. I think, admittedly, we would say that Canada is at least a quasi-socialist country, which is not the case in the United States. I mean, during election campaigns, you hear the word socialist bandied around and fascist bandied around. They're not necessarily bad titles. The 3 or the 5 best countries in the world to live in, according to various reports and magazines, are all socialist countries and have a socialist bent to them. So,
and I think those countries always rate highest for happiness as well.
Exactly, they're in the happiness quotient. The Norways, Denmarks, Swedens, etc. Canada has similar values and similar benefits. The United States doesn't have that. So, and if the United States perceives, and people and Americans perceive, that these rights are going to be even diminished in the United States, not that that necessarily is the case, that's an impetus to come to Canada. But there are other opportunities. What about the business opportunities in Canada?
Well, I mean, certainly there are opportunities of that nature. It's always going to be easier for someone who has a job offer here in terms of quick access. If an American citizen has a job offer in Canada and they're a professional, we could potentially have them here in 2 to 3 weeks type of thing. For people who are more entrepreneurial or have their own businesses, there's opportunities to establish a branch or a subsidiary of that company in Canada. The criteria for that have recently got a little bit more stringent. You have to have a solid business plan. You have to show that the new operation will sustain someone who's in a managerial or executive role. And they also rolled back the duration of work permits in that case. Now you get a 1-year work permit off the bat, and then it will only be renewed for a 3-month increment, a 6-month increment initially, before you got 2 more years. There's ways to be strategic about that, and that could potentially flow into permanent residence. I think one of the important things, though, in terms of permanent residence, especially now that the government has announced the recent immigration level changes, which is cutting back on the number of permanent residents that Canada will be accepting in 2025, 2026, and 2027. I mean, it's still an astronomical number. Like, I think the lowest year takes it down to 386 something thousand, so that's still an awful lot of people.
Yeah, it brings it back to levels that were merely 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah,
it's not
exactly.
that dramatic. Yeah.
No, but so while I mentioned that for people who have access to Canadian citizenship and they're in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, that isn't necessarily the case as far as permanent residence is concerned. The real sweet spot in terms of age for permanent residence is between like 21 and 34, because we do use a point system, and the points really drop off once you go over 33, 34. After 44, you get 0 for age, and as I mentioned, it is a huge point allocation. But for people who have masters, an educated spouse, I mean, there's still possibilities. Again, having a job offer in Canada will really improve your situation. And then another huge thing, I guess we'd have to be looking at people who live in Louisiana. That's the only place I can think of that's vaguely French in the US, or if someone happened to go to school abroad and is fluent in French, there's good opportunities for French speakers as long as you don't want to go to Quebec. We're not going to get into Quebec because that's a whole different ball of worms. And for that matter, Quebec has in the past few days actually effectively closed their major permanent residence categories. So that's a little messy. For entrepreneurs, I think another really good thing to consider is the startup visa. There's opportunities for people who have a past track record in establishing businesses. There's a way you're partnered up with an incubator. You can get a work permit initially to come here and get the business off the ground. And then there's a way that sort of flows into permanent residence. For individuals who have companies that trade with Canada. So that could be trade in terms of service. So let's say you are a management consultant and you have Canadian clients. There's a way to get work permits on that basis. Likewise, if you want to buy a business in Canada, there's opportunities to be a treaty investor. So
right, yeah, and that's a really good point, because it's been around for almost 40 years.
And it's very underutilized.
Tremendously
both
underutilized.
Of those categories.
So, I mean, these are products of the formerly North American Free Trade Agreement, now CUSMACA, or if you're going in the other direction, USMACA. The interesting thing is people were fearful that the Free Trade Agreement and its renegotiation might fall. People from Canada who are in the United States would lose their visas. None of that happened under President Trump in 2016 to 2020. There's no reason to believe that's going to happen now. There are treaties with the United States with 60 or 70 countries in the world, some of which have existed for over 100 years. I see no reason in the world to abrogate, dozens and dozens of treaties that would cripple the U.S. economy. So this is going to stay, in my view, and it's a great opportunity for Americans to come to Canada, as we've said, dramatically underutilized.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, quite frankly, I don't think that Trump's focus is going to be on preventing, Canadians from going into the U.S. Like, his focus is on the southern border.
Oh, without question.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, without question.
That's an unfortunate interruption.
No, that's our phone ringing. We're in our office, and we're here to answer phones, so that's fine. And by the way, welcome to our office, as this is the first of our discussions on the state of Canadian and immigration in general. And we look forward to our next installment.
Yeah, so you should like, subscribe, follow us on all our social channels, and stay tuned for more from Guberman Appleby Immigration updates. Ciao.